Gwynne Shotwell just lowered the entire community's expectations. Flight 13 will not reach orbit. That sounds like bad news. But here is the crazy part. Booster 20 has just quietly passed the very same test that destroyed Booster 18. A test that seemed harmless, yet one capable of tearing an entire booster apart. So the question becomes, if the objective has now become easier, why hasn't Booster 20 made it to Pad 2 yet? Let's find out. Booster 18 is not an unfamiliar name to anyone who has closely followed the Starship program. Last November, it entered what seemed like the simplest test in the entire process, a gas pressure test. The name alone sounds harmless, because this test does not use real propellant at all. It uses only nitrogen and oxygen gas to pressurize the lines, tanks, and the entire system. No fire, no chemical combustion, only pure compressed gas. Yet Booster 18 exploded right there. A few days later, it was removed from the program entirely. Part 2. Why a test using only gas could be this dangerous. Why can a test using nothing but gas produce such severe consequences? The answer lies in the true nature of this test. A gas pressure test is not meant to evaluate the engines. It tests the backbone of the entire vehicle. By pumping in gas at a pressure equivalent to that of a fully fueled booster, the engineering team is precisely replicating the structural load the vehicle's body must withstand under real flight conditions. In other words, this is the safest way to determine whether a booster's frame is sufficiently sound, without having to risk doing so with flammable propellant. Safer, but not without risk. Because if there exists any weak point in the structure, an imperfect weld, a wall thinner than designed, this test will expose it. And that is precisely what happened to Booster 18. Part 3. Booster 20 faces the exact same test and survives. Now, shift forward to this past June. Booster 20, B-18's successor in the role of booster for Flight 13, left Mega Bay 1 and rolled out to Massey's on June 5th. Over the course of 2 days, it completed 3 major tests. One of them was precisely the gas pressure test, the exact same test that had once ended Booster 18. Booster 20 passed it safely. Honestly, this is not merely a routine procedure. This is a milestone that deserves to be recognized. Because Booster 20 has just passed through the exact narrow door that swallowed its sibling and emerged on the other side intact. If you've ever watched a film in which the protagonist must confront the very fear that defeated their predecessor and survives it, that is exactly what Booster 20 has just done, in the precise technical sense of the term. After completing the cryo-proof, B-20 rolled back to Mega Bay 1 on June 10th. The purpose was to install 33 Raptor 3 engines and a set of Block 3 generation grid fins. This is the stage it is currently passing through. Part 4. What Shotwell said, and why lowering the target is a strategy. Now, return to Gwynne Shotwell's statement mentioned at the start of this video. In an interview with CNBC, she shared something fairly candid. SpaceX has already successfully performed a Raptor relight in space, so the team feels reasonably confident in that capability, but they still want one more suborbital flight to further reinforce the data before genuinely attempting orbital injection on Flight 14. In other words, Flight 13 will be an almost complete replica of Flight 12 in terms of flight trajectory. As for Flight 15, according to what Shotwell revealed, that is the flight under consideration for launch from Launch Complex 39A, contingent on FAA approval for orbital flight and the Florida infrastructure being ready. So why has SpaceX chosen this kind of incremental, small-step approach? Consider the logic behind this decision. Flight 12 already proved the most fundamental point, that the version 3 configuration of Starship is capable of lifting off, operating, and completing the majority of its mission. Flight 13 will now prove something further. That Flight 12's success was not a one-time stroke of luck, but a configuration that can be repeated and stabilized. Only once both of those points are confirmed will Flight 14 face the genuinely new challenge: orbital injection. This is an approach that decomposes risk into discrete, smaller layers, rather than concentrating an entirely new challenge into a single flight. Part 5. a fair comparison with Blue Origin. Viewed more broadly across the space industry, this is not a philosophy unique to SpaceX. Blue Origin, with its New Glenn program, is pursuing a similar direction. They prioritize confirming the stability of each system before expanding mission objectives toward more complex challenges. Of course, the development pace and team scale of the two companies differ considerably. But in terms of the cautious philosophy of step-by-step verification, this is a shared trait worth acknowledging fairly. To put it lightly, if we liken the Starship program to a role-playing game, then SpaceX is choosing to thoroughly farm experience before stepping into the boss fight, rather than charging straight in with the high-risk, high-reward gambling approach. And honestly, after what happened with Booster 18, this is likely the wiser choice. Part 6. Pad 2 is not standing still. The chopstick story. Now, while Booster 20 remains inside Mega Bay 1, let us turn to another story unfolding in parallel. This is what is actually happening at Pad 2, a site that might appear to be in a holding pattern. But in reality, the situation is entirely the opposite. The engineering team at Pad 2 has not been idle during this period. They removed the entire set of landing rails on the chopsticks pair and replaced them with a new, lighter version featuring more cutouts to reduce overall mass. At the same time, the skates on the carriage, the mechanism that allows the chopsticks pair to move smoothly along the launch tower, were also removed and replaced. This is a fairly minor technical detail, yet one that carries substantial significance when set against history. The launch tower at Pad 1 has never received a comparable upgrade to this skate system, and as a consequence, for an extended period, the chopsticks pair at Pad 1 frequently produced a creaking sound during operation. In other words, while Booster 20 still sits in the factory, the Pad 2 team is quietly upgrading its entire chopsticks assembly. This is not dead time. This is investment time. It is also worth noting that the overall condition of Pad 2 following Flight 12 was, in fact, quite favorable. The recorded damage was negligible, mainly a few burn marks that can be readily addressed by adding deluge systems to certain areas, along with some paint peeling on the booster's quick disconnect hoods. This is an indication that Pad 2's design withstood the stresses of an actual launch better than most had initially anticipated. Part 7. The timeline figures, and the two independent axes of Flight 13. Now return to the core question this video posed from the very start. When will Booster 20 actually be ready to head out to Pad 2? According to sources from NASA Spaceflight, one of the outlets most closely tracking activity at Starbase, Booster 20 is unlikely to appear at Pad 2 before mid-July. This is an updated figure, and one that is somewhat more accurate than earlier estimates based on conventional historical models, which typically follow the pace of older generation boosters. The reasoning behind this timeline is fairly straightforward when one considers the nature of the work involved. Installing 33 Raptor 3 engines, together with the Block 3 generation grid fins, requires that every connection be thoroughly verified. The fuel system, control system, and sensor system of each individual engine must be confirmed to function correctly before the vehicle leaves the factory. This is a process that cannot be shortened, regardless of how fully prepared Pad 2's infrastructure already is. And this is precisely the crux that allows us to fully answer the question raised at the start of the video. There are two entirely independent informational axes within the Flight 13 narrative. The first axis is the mission objective, determined by Gwynne Shotwell herself, and now made quite clear: a suborbital flight replicating Flight 12's configuration. The second axis is hardware progress, dictated by the physical nature of the assembly process. And this axis remains open, still moving day by day. Lowering the mission objective in no way shortens the time required to safely assemble a booster. This is precisely why, even though Flight 13 is now a technically easier mission, it remains no easier in terms of preparation timeline. Part 8. The remaining piece, Ship 40. Now, to obtain a complete picture, we must turn to the remaining piece of Flight 13, that is Ship 40. On June 25th, Ship 40 completed a noteworthy test, a single-engine static fire. This is the first Block 3 generation ship to undergo this type of test. The last time a Starship vehicle performed a single-engine static fire was Ship 37, back in July of last year. During the test, there was a rather interesting detail that close observers took note of. There was an unusual delay between T0 and the moment the engine actually ignited. There are currently two plausible hypotheses for this phenomenon. The first hypothesis is that the engineering team is trialing a new ignition procedure in preparation for in-space engine relights on future flights. The second hypothesis, simpler yet no less reasonable, is that the team is allowing the engine additional time to reach its standard temperature prior to ignition in order to minimize thermal shock and improve engine durability across multiple flights. Following this test, on June 26th, Ship 40 rolled back to the factory. The 6-engine static fire test, which had been expected to follow shortly thereafter, was postponed. The specific reason has not yet been disclosed. Honestly, this is a development that remains unclear, and I think we ought to acknowledge that candidly, rather than attempting to interpret it in an unconditionally positive light. But it should also be placed within the broader context. Because Booster 20 still remains at least several weeks away from its own 33-engine static fire, Ship 40 still retains sufficient buffer time to address any issue that may arise before it actually becomes the rate-limiting factor for the program as a whole. In other words, at this moment, Booster 20 remains the decisive variable, not Ship 40. So, based on everything we have just analyzed, what might unfold in the coming weeks? If Booster 20 completes assembly according to the estimate and reaches Pad 2 by mid-July, as NASA Spaceflight predicts, Flight 13 is entirely capable of occurring before the end of summer. But if, during the installation of the 33 engines, the team identifies additional adjustments deemed necessary based on data gathered from Flight 12, this timeline could continue to slip, potentially extending into the end of Q3. One point worth noting here. Because Flight 13 is now merely a repeat flight, no longer bearing the added burden of achieving orbital injection, the pressure compelling SpaceX to rush has diminished considerably compared to before. That means the company has greater latitude to prioritize safety over speed. And after what happened with Booster 18, this is likely precisely what we ought to hope they do. So, if Flight 14 is truly the flight that confronts the greatest challenge, orbital injection, just how much will what SpaceX has just learned from Booster 20 surviving the very test that killed Booster 18 matter for that leap forward? Booster 18 taught SpaceX a costly lesson. Booster 20 has just proven that lesson was correctly applied. Thank you all for following this analysis with me to the end. If you found it useful, please like, comment, and subscribe to the Space Brief. Tap the screen to watch more videos with me.